Viewers, it's my pleasure to have Pandit Satish Kumar Sharma ji one more time on PGurus channel as we talk about a lot of things happening in the United Kingdom. Pandit ji, namaskar and welcome to PGurus channel.
Namaskar, Sree. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's been a bit of a while, but underneath this COVID lockdown, I think we're all adjusting to a new reality. But it is great to be here. We have so much to talk about.
Yes, indeed, sir. And I want to first start out by looking at the house cleaning that appears to be happening in the United Kingdom's Labour Party. I'm hearing a lot of names, and can you please give us an update on what has been happening to Jeremy Corbyn, Claudia Webb, and also about the candidacy of Dr. Neeraj Patil?
It's a great place to start. So you've obviously heard that Jeremy Corbyn has been suspended from the Labour Party at this moment in time. And what was behind it was a dossier which was given to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission by the Jewish community and a number of prominent Jewish advocacy organizations. For a long time, they had been claiming and pressing the Labour Party to consider that there is a core of anti-Semitism, a group in the centre of the Labour Party who are openly anti-Semitic, and yet the Labour Party wasn't fulfilling its rights and duties and obligations to create a safe space for all communities. So lots of evidence had been gathered. It had been presented to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and the Human Rights Commission came to a conclusion and produced its report last week. And the report was very damning. It actually had two elements. One was that it agreed that the Labour Party was no longer a safe space. But the more damaging aspect was that there was a culture of political interference in preventing investigations from being fair, full, and totally frank in their outcome. And so those are the two main aspects of it. But as a result of it, Keir Starmer, the leader, he did give Jeremy Corbyn an opportunity to respond. Jeremy Corbyn responded in a very sober manner, but he did not acknowledge the extent to which this had been a problem. And because he was refusing to acknowledge the extent, there was politically no other option. And so they have suspended him. And from what I gather, there may even be further charges to be levied against Jeremy Corbyn. The interesting aspect to this is that as a Hindu community, we have also been on the receiving end of a degree of contempt and indeed discrimination from the Labour Party. I myself have spoken to Jeremy Corbyn on two occasions face to face to talk to them about this problem. But on both occasions, it was the political answer. Oh, yes, we'll get in touch. Thank you so much for your number. And then when you chase them up, nobody's responsive. Now, exactly in the same manner that the Jewish community put together their dossier, I too, myself and a small team, have put together a dossier of allegations, of events and of evidence to support that the Labour Party is institutionally Hindu-odic. Now, we had a problem with the EHRC a couple of years ago when they produced a premature, biased, discriminatory judgment on our Hindu community without any evidence. But now that the Jewish community has managed to get the EHRC to look at things from a more balanced and open perspective, we'll be submitting that dossier to them as well, because the Labour Party has become a toxic place for members of the Hindu community and the Indian community. I suspect your viewers will probably recall we spoke 2 days before the actual general election. 6 Labour councillors issued a statement about how toxic the Labour Party had become for them.
Yes,
and
I remember that.
Yeah. And that's just one of many incidents where it's been evident that the Labour Party is not a safe space for Indians and Hindus. And so while Sakir is clearing house and trying to get everything back onto an even keel, it's the appropriate time for them to consider the anti-India, anti-Hindu, anti-Modi bias that seems to have taken root. So that will be submitted to them. On the subject of the Labour Party, you mentioned Claudia Webb. She too has been suspended. A number of issues, but I think the core issue was allegations of her bullying and harassing another woman. And so That is still an allegation, but whilst it's being investigated, she's been suspended. And there is a rising tide in Leicester now, who are also beginning to learn that there is a great deal of power in accountability and demanding accountability and the mechanics of how to demand it. So I think we're actually looking for a great leap forward from our community in terms of how to exert and assert our needs and opinions, and how to really engage with this political process. Lots and lots happening right at the highest levels of the Labour Party in the Indian community.
And what about our friend Dr. Neeraj
Oh, yes.
Patil or Patel? I'm not 100% sure I got his last name right.
Dr. Neeraj Patil.
Patil.
That's right. So yes, I've been watching his progress, and he's got a lovely website has come up. Lots of little inquiries are coming out there. Tweets are going out there, and from what I can see, he's actually getting quite a good level of engagement. Now, this is his first time, and so it may well be that his name, the familiarity, all of those things that are so important, isn't going to be there. But this will certainly put him on the map. And the feedback I'm getting is that he's now beginning to gather a bit of support. So we have almost 2 weeks to go before the election concludes and voting is finished, and then the count will start. So fingers crossed, hopefully, if the Indian community, the Indian Labour community, and indeed the wider Labour community recognize the value of somebody of his experience and of genuine diversity that he brings to the table, we may be in for an upset. I'm optimistic, but not realistically expecting it to happen. There are people who have been in the Labour Party for 40, 50 years, activists at the highest level with global connections and national networks within the Labour Party. And so there are only 9 positions. But who knows? Stranger things have happened. Nobody expected Donald Trump to become president. I think you must have also seen in the US how everybody is playing all of the old 2016 polls and the people smirking and contemptuously writing him off. So who knows? Strange things happen in politics. Hopefully he'll put in a good showing, and somewhere along the line his vote will come in. So yes, fingers crossed. We're looking forward to some progress there.
So Satishji, about Claudia Webb, if she's suspended from the party, I think she's an MP right now. Would that seat also, would she have to resign her seat also?
Okay, so the way it works, we have a quaint English expression, which is the whip has been withdrawn from her. Okay, now it sounds quite, sounds like a criminal act or some sort of perverted engagement, yes. But what it actually means is that she is literally suspended. So she can't act as an MP, she can't participate in the normal activities that MPs get involved in, debates, to speak in the House and so on and so forth. So she is suspended whilst this investigation is continuing. Now, if the Leicester community, her constituents, manage to get organised, then I think there is a really good argument for them to put forward a proposal that actually they should ask for her deselection. That then would trigger a by-election, and that's what they really should do. So fingers crossed, who knows, it could happen. As I say, these are chaotic times and things are happening in months, which only a few years ago used to take decades to happen. So yes, lots and lots happening there.
And since you brought up the question of United States elections, might I remind our viewers from United Kingdom, there are about 8 to 9 Indian American candidates in the fray. One of them has already won. I don't know how many of you know. Raja Krishnamurthy was found to be so strong in his constituency, it's a suburb of Illinois, of Chicago, Illinois, that he's actually going through without an election. The Republicans did not even put up a candidate. And there's this Pramila Jayapal, then there is another person called, I think, Kulkarni. These two are a little contested candidates. Then there is one other new entrant from California, Rishi Kumar. He's contesting from one of my neighboring districts. He's also contesting on a Democratic ticket. So far, everybody that I have mentioned are all Democrats. And Rishi might stand a good chance of getting elected. And then on the Republican side, I have 3 friends. All of them I know well. I've actually given them a platform on PGurus to express their vision for their constituency, for their state and for their country. And these happen to be Nisha Sharma and Ritesh Tandon and Manga Anantatmula. And I can tell you, Manga has done so much work in the 11th district in Virginia. I would be very, very disappointed if she doesn't do extremely well. So these are the different people. And then there's also this dark horse candidate who is actually running as a write-in candidate. So what happens is, you know, in the United States, you have the primaries that both these parties hold. Now, there is another way that a candidate belonging to either of these parties can still contest, and that is as a write-in candidate. In a write-in candidate, what happens is, you know, where you have a panel of candidates for, like, say, senator, you can write in the name. I want Dr. Shiva Ayadurai.
Oh, wow.
And if there are enough, he can get elected. This has happened in the past.
What an incredible idea. And it's great to hear that roll call. You've mentioned it. I've just had a notice that in New Zealand, we have our first parliamentary representative there. Ms. Radhakrishnan has been elected.
Priyanka with a C, Radhakrishnan, yes.
That's right. And, so, yes, Dharma is rising. It's great to see our people finally realizing that actually politics is a prerequisite to happiness and success. It's not a dirty word anymore. So great news. Well, good luck to all of those candidates. Let's hope they start to make a really good showing.
Yes, indeed. And then if Dr. Shiva Ayadurai were to make it to the Senate, we would have friends in the Senate as well as in the Congress. And let's move on, sir. Here's the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about. This is regarding the LTTE, Liberation of Tamil Tigers of Veeram. And one judge seems to have suggested to the United Kingdom government that they re-look at the ban that has been imposed on LTTE. What are the dynamics behind this? What was the reason for the judge to come to that conclusion? And how do you see things play out, sir?
It's a very important issue that has arisen here. I'm not going to go into the background of what happened in Sri Lanka and South India at that time, but we have to recognize that there has been a period of tranquility once some of those issues were addressed. A part of getting to that period of tranquility was the British government recognizing that the LTTE was engaging in extremist activities, and so they added them to the list of terrorist organizations. Now, this is quite a serious act to have happened, and they've been on that list ever since. Now, since that list, that addition was made, a number of people who were part of that organization were given asylum in the US and given asylum here in the UK, and they have been quite active behind the scenes. My understanding is that the initial application was made to the US. The US said, well, they were added to the UK list first, and so you need to please go and petition them. Now, here in the UK, we have an organization which is a classic British organization. When judges retire, they don't quietly disappear to a tranquil existence over in the Cotswolds or in the depths of Oxfordshire and, you know, just going for fishing and things like that. They join very active groups. And there's one particular group of some 80 retired and current judges, which actually holds together the notion of how people get onto this list and how they get off this list. So these judges gather and they have a look at the evidence and then make a recommendation and present an opinion and a judgment. And so what has happened is that this organization has actually said that the government should remove the LTTE from this list. The Home Secretary has the option of appealing against this judgment. But this is where it gets a little bit more political and a little bit more interesting. Now, if the Home Office doesn't appeal, then that judgment potentially at some time in the near future will become a valid judgment and the LTTE would be taken off the list. Now, we know that that would be an act which would contribute towards a great degree of instability in Sri Lanka and indeed in India. I've had the pleasure of meeting Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of Sri Lanka. This is Sree Senaji, and she's very concerned about this particular issue. And I know that she's using her office and all of the power at her disposal to present evidence to the Home Secretary so the Home Secretary can make a decision. This has been going on for about 10 months. And so this is not as something that's just suddenly appeared. It's a process that pretty much most of us were aware of. And in that time, there was ample opportunity for bureaucracies and for administrations, the MEA as well as the Sri Lankan Foreign Service, to make representations to the Home Secretary and say, here's all the evidence. This is our position. And so we would like you now to appeal against that judgment and do not take the LTTE off this particular list.
When you say MEA, you mean the Ministry of External Affairs of
India.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, yes. So we have a Home Secretary here in the United Kingdom. She has the authority to be able to appeal against this judgment and present evidence, but she will have to bear the consequences of that decision. And bearing in mind that in this country, there's a very robust sector which holds the government to account for its decisions, she would become pretty much personally responsible for that decision. She'd have to stand and justify it. So she, I'm confident, Priti Patelji, our Home Secretary, will be requiring robust evidence to be presented by the MEA in India and by the Sri Lankan government of a quality which would withstand scrutiny in a court. Without that evidence, I suspect she would not want to take the risk of making this judgment on behalf of an overseas, regarding an overseas organization, which is, shall we say, pertinent and relevant to the affairs of 2 foreign nations. It would be unusual for a Home Secretary to do that. I do know that in the past, when a Home Secretary has made a decision at the request of a government, on the understanding that evidence would be forthcoming, and the evidence didn't materialize, the case fell through, people who were designated as terrorists were actually released, and the Home Secretaries, the British government probably had to pay, I think, a bill of about £1.2 million as a result of the legal process and damages and costs or something along those lines. So she'll be waiting for the evidence to come through. What we really need is for the Indian government to produce the evidence of sufficient quality for her to make that decision. Now, you and I both know that Dr. Swamiji had been quite influential in the affairs of that dispute. And we know that he is pressing to make sure that the government fulfills its responsibilities and any requests that are made to it are actually satisfied. But at the end of all of it, there is a bureaucracy in India, there is a bureaucracy in Sri Lanka, and there's a bureaucracy here in the United Kingdom. And unless the representatives of all of those bureaucracies can actually get really good, solid communications going, be aware of the processes involved, the legal processes involved, the representations that have to be made, the quality and the nature of those representations, there's every possibility of it falling sort of between the stools. Now, time is of the essence, because if I recall, a response has to be lodged by the 4th, which is only a few days away. And so perhaps we have a visit of the Indian Foreign Secretary. I think he's arriving today or tomorrow. And this should be on his desk as something that urgently needs attending to if it hasn't already been attended to. And as I say, I know the Sri Lankan High Commissioner's office are very, very diligently trying to fulfill this. So it's possible that if the Indian government and indeed the Sri Lankan government do want the LTTE for whatever reasons to remain designated as a terrorist organization, that they need to produce the evidence for it. And if they do, I suspect the status won't change. But it's one of those cases where really good quality proactive engagement is vital. So we shall watch this space, and I'll bring you up to speed on our next outing.
Thank you, sir. And this is yet another instance of PGurus acting like a thermometer, saying that the patient has a fever. And I think Panditji has already walked the extra mile by meeting with the Sri Lankan High Commissioner and sharing his thoughts and his concerns. And I hope that Sri Shringla, who is going to be visiting, I think he's still the Foreign Secretary, Ashok Shringla, and
Yes.
would address this. And people from the PMO office in India, I'm told, watch PGurus videos, and let's hope that these things, get put on fast track. And see, it's what we want. We know that LTTE practically decimated the Tamil leadership, political leadership, called the TULF, and many other outfits that were all voices for the Tamils. They more or less obliterated everybody else, and by means not fair. That's all I can say. We are not going to talk about what happened in the conflict. We are talking about today and here, and I think this needs to be taken up. And let's hope that it happens. So the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and this is a very important topic, of what is happening in France. Now, finally, Emmanuel Macron seems to have woken up to what has been told by us for a long time. PGurus with Professor RV has been talking about Europe being renamed Eurobia for the last 2 years now. And suddenly it seems like things are beginning to unravel rather quickly. Now, a little bit of what you saw of what happened in France, there seems to have been some fallout in the other countries. And I have a follow-up question once we get past this point, sir.
Yes, the devastating and tragic incident where a teacher, Samuel Paty, was murdered for showing a class who were discussing freedom of speech some cartoons, has reverberated around Europe. And it has led to a heightened state of tension and alert in most of the capitals of Europe now. And France is really accelerating towards a state of high emergency. So this happened only a short while ago. What the ramifications have been quite devastating. I think there were 3 other deaths which occurred immediately afterwards in other towns, and there have been 1 or 2 other assaults as well. There are dimensions of this, though, which are deeply concerning. We've just talked about the LTTE, and it reminded me of something Churchill said, where he said, jaw is better than war. That as long as there are people who are willing to talk using their jaws, then the prospect of a conflagration, of a violent escalation is avoided. And that applies in all arenas. The speed with which violence appeared on the scene, from showing cartoons, all of a sudden there is now a situation where violence of the most heinous kind is being witnessed, is an indication of the incendiary and a tinderbox situation that we're in. The LTTE situation was the same. It was as a result of a great deal of effort by many people that some sort of tranquility and normalcy was brought back to normal people's existence. France is now in that situation where it needs to decide on a course of action whereby it can bring safety back to the lives of French citizens. The sentiment has actually rippled throughout Europe. The Dutch government is now considering the option of being able to remove citizenship from persons deemed to have been engaged in such activities, which is a dramatic shift. There is a piece of law which says that you cannot remove a person's citizenship and render them stateless. It'll be interesting to see how they overcome that hurdle. Here in the United Kingdom, there's been now again an escalation in the conversation. But there's one aspect which is quite worrying. The majority Muslim community has the opportunity and the ability to be able to prevent an escalation. There are 2 choices. One is that they support the rule of law, freedom of expression, and also the legislative choices of a people, of a nation. The French have chosen fraternity, liberty, equality as their guiding principles. And so a citizen of that country really should honor those principles. So the wider Muslim community, the leadership, has the options of saying, actually, no, everybody should follow the law of the land, and this is a terrible issue. But the most vocal voices that have been heard have been actually in support of the murderer, of the extremist who killed this teacher. In Pakistan, only yesterday there were 50,000 gathered in protest against Prime Minister Macron's statements. So there is an escalation which is occurring, and that's not a good thing to see. There is one aspect of this which is interesting, though. You will recall, I'm sure, we talked about it. CAA was introduced by the Indian government to give a fast track to citizenship for people who were seeking refuge from the neighboring Islamic countries because their lives were endangered. There were many, many instances of Hindus, of Buddhists, of Sikhs, and of Christians in Pakistan, for example, whose lives were in danger. And indeed, many of them had family members who were killed. And so CAA was introduced in order to fast track that process. There were people inside of India who had been in India and stateless for a long period of time. And so this process was also going to accelerate their journey to becoming Indian citizens. And yet Europe, the Western world, was up in arms saying that this is Islamophobic, that this discriminates against Muslims, and that India is acting in a manner which is contrary to secularity. But none of those voices are now saying that, hold on one moment, what has happened to this teacher on the basis of Islam, on the basis of Islamist beliefs, is something that we should be perhaps more magnanimous about. And we shouldn't be talking about removing the right of travel. And Pakistan and Bangladesh have both been mentioned as countries for whom travel is going to be restricted into European countries. But nobody in Europe is saying, no, 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 that's Islamophobic. You know, there is a dichotomy, there is an imbalance here in the manner in which anything India does can be translated into something to negate and to criticize the Indian choices. And yet when exactly the same situations arise here amongst the white European Christian community, it's a totally different rule book that's applied. It's going to be an education. In this country for a long time, the Indian community has been trying to educate the establishment on the basis of our, shall we say, 900 years of experience with Islamism. And yet we have been pretty much scoffed at, and that's the most gentle sort of response that we get. You probably recall 3 years ago, I held an event in the British Parliament called Tolerating the Intolerant. And at that event, we presented the evidence of the loss of 45 million Hindus from Bangladesh. And Tapan Ghosh presented evidence, and there were other speakers who were presenting similar sort of profiles and evidence. And we were so maligned and criticized and vilified and denigrated as having been Islamophobic. But none of the people at the actual event itself. We had Buddhist monks there. Everybody was very, very relaxed and thought this was a really good event. But outside, that machinery kicked in, and we were castigated and really made to feel quite uncomfortable by false allegations of Islamophobia. There were Islamic scholars in the event, but that didn't make any difference to anyone. And now all of a sudden, 3 years down the road, one incident of a teacher being killed, and suddenly it has struck home. I'm sure that somewhere along the line, the Kashmiri Pandits will step up and say, you've just had one teacher killed. We had tens of thousands of similarly educated people slaughtered, and yet you have never acknowledged our grief. You have never advocated for our rights. This duplicity, this double standard is going to become very uncomfortable for the British administration and the European administrations. So I think they probably would do well to look at their appreciations for principle as opposed to profit. You know, it's a common statement, isn't it, that we who have studied a bit of British history make, that principles are applicable only when they're profitable. If it's not profitable, then that principle can be put on hold for a short period of time. But these are issues where those principles need to be adhered to in a manner which is sacrosanct. And I think the British public has realized this. They're going to start to call their own politicians to account and demand protection from these ideologies, these extremist activities. So it's going to be a very strange time in front of us.
So here comes my follow-on question, Panditji. First off, based on what you just said, I'm reminded of a phrase that gets uttered frequently amongst the bureaucratic circles in India. It goes this way: show me the face and I will show you the rule. So what you said just now brought memories of something similar, that different rules apply to different people, and these are all selectively applied.
Yes, it's true. I say the dharmic ethos is that we adhere to principles because principles work over a long term. We have observed that if you hold on to a principle, it might have a short-term cost. It might have a short-term element of discomfort, but we have learned, and this is our wisdom, that those principles over a longer term always come out to everybody's benefit. And there is a net gain, there is an increase in prosperity, tranquility, and harmony. So we adhere to principles come hell or high water, through thick and thin. But people who don't have that very long-term view, they often say, well, a principle is great for a period of time, but then the moment profit demands something else, we leave the principle, jump onto the profit, and then try and come back to it. And this is going to prove to be very expensive. We've said before that in Pakistan, the non-Islamic community was 27% when it came to partition, and is now down to 2%. And we're on a daily basis hearing of dreadful things being done to Christian minority members, Hindu minority members, temples being desecrated, etc. This hasn't just happened in the last week. This has been going on for the best part of 30 years, 40 years. And yet the European nations, and Britain especially, which does have a little bit of a responsibility for having created Pakistan in the first place, they have managed to completely ignore that, because principles can be put on hold when profit and political shenanigans are more important. But it comes back to bite, and I think it's coming home. So hopefully we will see wisdom arising sooner rather than later.
Yes, indeed. So last question, sir, before we hang up on this discussion, before we complete this discussion. I have been reading that Germany has started expelling a lot of illegals, and that many of them are headed for Calais onwards to United Kingdom. How does the United Kingdom government see this? Are they planning on bringing in a law? And what went wrong in Germany, in your opinion? Because this is something that seems to have started happening fairly quickly.
That's a great question. And it is something that the United Kingdom is going to have to understand and deal with, because, as you say, a movement of these migrants towards England, one, it's been there for a long time and it's likely to increase. This is a difficulty. You know, we've observed for a period of time, I have a British passport, okay? And what a passport means is that you have a right to pass through a port. Yeah, that you have already established a certain credibility, your credentials have been checked, you're deemed to be safe and an asset to that particular country, and therefore you're entitled to pass through that port. But increasingly on a daily basis, the passport is becoming meaningless, isn't it? Because people who don't follow and who have no loyalty to those standards, they're arriving on the shores and claiming all sorts of asylum and claiming all sorts of detriment. And what they're trying to do is to really leverage the conscientiousness, the compassion that is in the heart of good people. But you and I know that the most scurrilous of charlatans and fraudsters does exactly the same thing. They leverage the compassionate naivety of a good person for their personal benefit and for the detriment of that particular person. And so we have always had a group of people in every country whose job it is to determine whether we're dealing with a genuine person who is here on asylum, on the basis of asylum, or whether we're dealing with an economic migrant. or indeed we're dealing with a criminal who is actually looking for greener pastures where they can inflict more crimes. Those questions have to be asked. They're all grown-up sort of questions. But the major problem that we've had is that most people who call themselves liberals have forgotten that there are very simple, harsh realities. I've had many conversations with people who traditionally would have been the liberals who are saying, yes, we should have open borders and everything else. And they're wonderful principles until you ask them, do you have a lock on your front door? And the moment that you ask them, have they got a lock on the front door, and ask them why, and they acknowledge the reality that there are nasty people out there who, if you didn't have the door locked, would come in, do you harm and steal whatever you've managed to gain for your family and create for your own well-being. So there's a harsh reality that there are people who are actually not here for the benefits of the resident domestic population. And we have to have a mechanism for stopping, for searching, for inquiring and establishing whether those people are genuinely welcome in this country, or whether we should be wary of them because of potential criminal or terrorist backgrounds. So this is an issue that's appearing in front of the British government pretty much on a daily basis. The numbers have been increasing. I think what we're going to see is that the Compassion Without Borders group are going to start to become a little bit more realistic and recognize that what happened to Samuel Paty in France shouldn't have happened. And it wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a very lax, open arms to everybody approach without actually checking whether those people were safe, whether those people were actually going to be positive contributors and supporters of the society that they wanted to move into. We will see this shift. We will see an awakening and a recognition of the reality. You know, we have in the Rig Veda, one of our main mantras is Asatoma Sat Gamaya, right? Tamasoma Jyotir Gamaya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. And if you're going to move from the state of Mrityu to Amrit, the absence of death, you have to go from Asat to Sat as well. What is the reality? And the reality is something that we're now going to start to have to face. Those days of nice, soft, warm, the world is wonderful, there are no nasty people, you know, and can't we all get on? Sadly, I think they have been now undermined by the existence of people who would do us harm and who have no loyalty to the families, to the societies that have been created over several generations. When you think the environment here in Britain, there are very hardworking people whose grandparents, parents, children have all worked to contribute to a particular way of living, a particular way of the society functioning. And those are really valuable things. They're valuable things. In the world wars, people died to preserve and protect those things. And yet, just to open the doors and say, yes, we're welcoming people who don't value those is no longer going to be a modus operandi in Europe. And it'll be a loss, but it is a loss which is directly attributable to violent extremist ideologies.
Well, sobering thought there. And as always, it's a pleasure to have you on our channel, Panditji. Namaskar, and we'll be back again with more things. If you want to add something, please go ahead.
Well, I was just saying that to myself, I was thinking that Deepavali is just around the corner. And you know, that's a reminder to us that with courage and with a focus on principles, Sri Ramchandraji was Maryada Purushottam, as we call him, you know, the epitome of the person who adheres to principles. You know, it's a great time to reflect upon the lessons that the Ramayana teaches us. And so I would wish everybody a Shubh Deepavali, and hopefully it'll be a time where we can gather all of our energy like we normally do, celebrate the great gift of being Sanatan Dharmis. It's an incredible privilege and a benefit for us. And pulling all that together, let's see whether we can bring light in the darkness, one of winter, but also in these COVID times when people are feeling particularly vulnerable and particularly low energy. So Shubh Deepavali to everyone, and best wishes to everyone, and we'll speak very soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Namaskar and Shubh Deepavali to everyone. you.